Hello and welcome back to Footy A to Z. Today's upload is going to be a little bit different. To get well and truly into the spirit of finals fever, we'll be hosting the Ruck Rovers podcast on the Western Bulldogs' dream premiership run back in 2016. If you enjoy the podcast, then please make sure to check down below to find links to more of his content. But now just quickly, we'll give you a little preview of this episode, which will be part 1 of 2. It is one of the best football podcasts we have ever listened to, and it beautifully captures the fairytale run the Bulldogs made, not just from 7th place, but decades of disappointment. And with that, we'll leave you in the midst of a capturing yarn between the Ruck Rover, aka Christian Barron, and his good mate Alex.
Welcome to the Ruck Rover. So good to have you with us, and I'm joined on the line today by none other than Alex Walters, the big wing dog, the Nat 5 to my David Mundy, all the way from London. Alex, how are you?
G'day, KB. I'm good. Thank you for the Nat 5 comparison. Unlike Nat 5, I can barely get off the ground these days, but that's very generous of you.
But you do have excellent hair as well, so it does make up for it.
Well, that's true, yeah. And of course, the sleeve guard, left arm buckets only.
Yeah, exactly right, yeah. You both have equal use for that shooting sleeve, the pair of you, yeah.
That's right, absolutely.
What's going on? How are things in London?
Things in London are good. The seasons have changed for the better. It's sunny outside. Brexit drags on interminably. So the great national crisis, the great national depression, no signs of abating or resolution. So the country just staggers on.
Sounds a bit like us and being Fremantle fans.
Quite, yes. No resolution in sight, no joy in sight.
Well, I'm really pumped that you are joining me today because we have been wanting to do this for a very, very, very long time. And what we're about to talk about today on the Ruck Rover is possibly our favourite AFL yarn of all time. Alex, what are we talking about today on the Ruck Rover?
We are talking about, of course, the 2016 Western Bulldogs Premiership. My favourite grand final of all time. At the time it happened, my 3-word review of the grand final was narrative beats millionaires. It is the quintessential AFL fairy tale story. It was the best.
It is so good, and we are going to go through it in absolute detail. And I'm really excited about this because hopefully by the time this comes out, we'll have really rusted on AFL fans who are joining us here, but also some people who, might be aware of the Western Bulldogs and the fact that they are a club and they do in fact exist, but might not know about the history of this club that led up to 2016. And hopefully we might have some people who are just unaware of this at all, in which case you're about to be treated to, I would argue, one of the greatest Australian sporting stories of all time, but definitely for me, the number one narrative for the AFL.
Fantastic story. A club that had suffered for a very long time, had a lot of moments, which we will get to, where they got close, but not close enough. And they just have this fairy tale season. You would probably argue before their time. They had been building as a really tremendous young club with a great list. But it came before everyone was ready, and it came in a way where each final built upon the last to this ascending point, this wonderful crescendo. Each game of that final series they played in, there was a great story within each one, and we're going to get to that. But it's so good. It makes me so happy. I'm a long-suffering Dockers fan, as UKB, and it felt like the closest we have got to experiencing a Dockers premiership.
It really did make you feel like anything was possible. And anyway, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We're going to the final series. I think let's take it all the way back. And for this club, who has been around for a long, long period of time, but as we were talking about off air, actually, one of the interesting things about this club as well is not only has it done it tough, but also it's done it tough in a lot of obscurity. So we'll take it from the very beginning. And I think a great place to set the tone is this simple fact. That's before the year 2016, the Western Bulldogs had won a solitary premiership in their existence, and it was in 1954. Positively a lifetime ago. They made one grand final since then, and that was a losing effort in 1961. And that actually prompted John Elliott, the former Carlton president, in the year 2000 to remark that they had a, quote, tragic history. And I think the full quote was something like, there has never been a more tragic history of a club, and then it was, close brackets, than that of the Western Bulldogs. This club has toiled for so long, and as we said, toiled in a lot of obscurity, as opposed to the likes of the grand clubs, that are sort of lionized like Collingwood and Carlton, who may have done it tough at various times. The Western Bulldogs toiled in obscurity, and when they dared to sort of go above that obscurity, they were met with heartbreak. Alex, is that fair?
It's fair. 54, they win the flag with Charlie Sutton and EJ Whitten, but for those of us who are modern AFL fans, well, when I say modern, you need to have been a fan in the 90s. We remember EJ Whitten for, coaching the Vics in the State of Origin and saying we really wanted to stick it up them, and, the AFL community being in mourning when he passed away. But that's it late in his life. It's black and white footage when the Bulldogs won their last premiership. 54, as you mentioned, they lost one in 61. 1989, they're on the verge of bankruptcy in a merger with Fitzroy, which they only just managed to stave off. 1990, Tony Liberatore wins the Brownlow. They get a bit of up for that. And then they assemble a team that in the second half of the 90s starts to be competitive. And it's quite a good team. And their moment really comes in 1997. It's a good team at this point. Tony Liberatore, Scott West, Chris Grant, superstar mobile centre-half forward, a young Brad Johnson, Scotty Wine and Luke Darcy. There's two serious players there. Ron Smith, James Cook. I mean, they had a really good team. And their moment is in 1997.
So 1997, to set the stage, is where they're in a preliminary final and they haven't been to this sort of hallowed ground in a long, long time. And something interesting to note as well about this club as well is it's a very working class background in Footscray. It's a long way from the glitz and the glamour of some of the other clubs and some of the other areas that those clubs represent. And this team that they've assembled at the time, which is probably their best to date, really does reflect that, with the likes of Tony Liberatore as a Brownlow medalist, who is essentially a thuggish tagger, and a brilliant one at that. And talk us through, Alex, what happens in the year 1997 when the Bulldogs dare to dream.
Yeah, 1997 is a really good preliminary final. Second quarter, the Bulldogs really cracking. They jump the Crows, kick 8 goals to 4 in the second quarter, jump out to a handy halftime lead. They're 22 points up at 3 quarters. And the last quarter of that preliminary final is an all-time classic. So there's a moment in the last, they're 22 points up, throw in the left forward pocket, Tony Liberatore sharks it from the pack and snaps. And the ball is sailing, and it's sailing close to the left-hand goalpost. And Tony Liberatore is being held horizontally by his teammates in celebration when the goal umpire signals it's a behind. So rather than the game being iced at that moment, a controversial call keeps the Crows in it. And from that moment on, Darren Jarman takes over. He starts clunking these contested marks and kicks 3 in the second half of the last quarter. And at the same time that he does that, Simon Goodwin ices this really clutch goal from the right forward pocket. The Bulldogs start to fall apart. Mark West, who played fantastically well on the day, who wasn't playing AFL the season before and had a real whale of a preliminary final, tearing through the ground, streaming into an open 50 with 2.5 left, with the Bulldogs up by 2 points and the chance to probably ice the game. From about 40 out, he could have run another 20 metres, but he lets fly and misses. And so the Crows take the lead, and with less than 2 minutes left, Chris Grant manages to scruff a kick from the right-hand side of the goal square after a teammate runs into him and somehow misses from about 6 metres out.
It is so agonisingly close.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of Stephen Milne in the drawn grand final when the ball just bounces the wrong way. it almost felt like they were cursed. And the Crows managed to hang on and win by 2 points. And you forget that if the Bulldogs had won, we would have had a St Kilda Western Bulldogs grand final. And neither side had won a flag for so many years. But it didn't happen. The Crows win in 97. Bulldogs make it back to the preliminary final in 98. Play the Crows again. The Crows absolutely destroy them. It's over at halftime. They win by more than 10 goals. They go back to back. And 97's their moment, and they lost it.
I don't know what's more tragic, the fact that they were so close that Tony Liberatore is being held aloft by his teammates, thinking that he has won the game in the final quarter only to lose, or the fact that had they won, as I say, the Crows went on to be premiers. But what's even more tragic than that, the fact that it's a preliminary final. Do you know what I mean? They hadn't even reached the grand final to really have that crack at real glory. I think that just sums it up completely, because you're talking about someone like St Kilda who are also just an absolute state of longing all the time. They have these huge, at least epic moments in which they really, were good for several years. They played in several grand finals. They own all these moments. The Western Bulldogs own a losing preliminary final by 2 points to an eventual premier. That is their sort of greatest mark on the game to that date, other than the Tony Liberatore Brownlow. And so that happens. They lose twice, and then they go back into the wilderness of Western Melbourne. And it takes them 10 years to get back to that point. And they assemble, and I want to argue that they assemble their next team is probably the best team that they had assembled to date. And that team had on the back line, it had the likes of Brian Lake and Dale Morris holding down the key position spots. It had Hargraves as just an absolutely phenomenal third tall kind of mid-sized swing defender. You had Lindsay Gilby just arcing off a halfback flank, smashing the ball on his left boot. A midfield that boasted the likes of Daniel Cross's slick hands. You had Scott West in there. You had Matthew Boyd. You had Brownlow medalist Adam Cooney in his absolute prime. And then a forward line that had some really interesting pieces in it. You had Mitch Hahn as a hit-up forward. You had Bob Murphy, who was kind of swinging between forward and back. And you had the smiling assassin in Brad Johnson. Just one of the most universally liked mid-sized forwards, and he was an absolute stellar human being. And so they assembled this great pool of talent. What did you think of that team, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, the other ones are Ryan Griffin at the peak of his powers.
Sure. Who will actually, we should mention Ryan Griffin, because Ryan Griffin becomes hyper relevant later on in this yarn.
In this story. Yes, he does. That backline, Lindsay Gilby, Jared Harbrow, Ryan Hargraves, I've never seen a backline move it so well. They were so good because their field kicking was unbelievable. Lindsay Gilby just managed to find these 1.5-meter pockets. They were my favourite team to watch in the late 2000s because they were so attacking. You forget they also had up forward Gian Syracusa, Sean Higgins. They would add Ackermanis and Barry Hall through the trio of preliminary finals. They were so fun to watch. They were so good, and yet those trio of preliminary finals came in this period when there were some of the great teams of the 2000s were assembled, and they just always came up short.
So that is something good to mention is, and we should probably foreground that is, they go to 3 preliminary finals in a row, and it's been roughly 10 years since their last. So in 97, 98, and then they arrive back on the scene to a preliminary final in 2008. And they lose in 2008. They lose in 2009. And they lose in 2010. And you're exactly right. They're the victims of these other great narratives kind of happening around them, which is even more tragic to me. The fact that they're falling victim to someone else's redemption. So I suppose we should start in 2008, where they lose to the Geelong Cats.
Yeah. So the Cats game, the Bulldogs start well, but the 2008 preliminary final, of course, the Cats would be shocked the following week by the Hawks. But
sure, of course.
You remember watching that Geelong team at the time, and when they were on, they really did purr.
They lost one game for the regular season to Collingwood, I believe, that entire year.
And that game, when they beat the Bulldogs, you had to feel for the Bulldogs because it was 22 points, something like that. And the Bulldogs played well. It's just Geelong in games like that, you felt like they were the best team in the last 20 years. It was pure silk. And so the first one you felt, okay, well, surely Geelong will win. As it is, they're shocked the next week. But Geelong were that generational team. I mean, we hadn't seen anyone so good as it would turn out since that kind of trio of Lions premierships at the start of the century. They were unbelievable. And the Bulldogs fired a shot. They just weren't good enough in that first one.
In the words of Omar, they came at the king and they did in fact miss. And we talk about how we talk about how attacking that Western Bulldogs team was, but I've never seen a team move the ball like that Geelong team did. They would move it straight up the middle. They would literally be marking on their knees, sliding into marks, and hand passing to another player who would be running past just to keep the ball moving as quickly as possible. But they lose that one. But the real heartbreak out of all of these three has to come the year later, where they play in the preliminary final, the St Kilda Football Club, led by Nick Riewoldt. And this is probably, I mean, St Kilda fans have a better sense than I do, but for me, this was the moment that I felt like St Kilda had arrived on the scene. They had a phenomenal season in 2009. But at the same time, they met the Western Bulldogs, and with a few minutes to go, I believe it's 1 point the difference, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so 2009 is tough for the Bulldogs. It's an attritional preliminary final, low scoring. There's something neat about the fact these two clubs who've been starved for success for so long would both in this period get so close. St Kilda are the greatest team that never was.
That's true.
They, 2009, the grand final is the moment where the toe poke to Ablett to the Chapman goal just breaks their heart. So this game is a real seesaw. There's a minute left. The Saints are up by a point. Riewoldt, the one who held St Kilda together. They're up by a point. There's a scrimmage at the top of the Saints square, and Riewoldt manages to soccer amongst all these hands the match winner. And they came at the Saints so hard, and it was such a good game, and they fell short. And that was their moment.
That was the moment. Yeah, that was the moment that the heist was truly on. Because history of the AFL and any sport generally is littered with teams that deserved it more and had the better year and, quote, should have won, but they fall in spectacular circumstances to a random act of chance or an ambush in the first quarter that no one saw coming. And I remember thinking, watching that game, that the Bulldogs were definitely in and amongst that heist. They had the chance to really take that one away and steal the narrative. And the thing I remember the most is a big key forward like Nick Riewoldt imposing himself in that last quarter and on that game and on that goal specifically to break their hearts and to send them home early for a second year in a row.
He has two moments in the last 7 minutes.
He does,
the Bulldogs are up 52-48 with 7 to play. And then Riewoldt just takes this classic.
He goes in for a huge, which is
that.
Yeah, exact. Sorry to talk over you then, but yeah, exactly right. And it is an sort of replayed moment, his performance in those final moments of that game. But we should say that obviously they go on to lose the grand final to St Kilda and keep their own narrative of woe alive, losing to the Geelong Cats, who were stunned the year earlier, and they get to complete their redemption arc. But there is no redemption arc for the Western Bulldogs. They go away, and this is an important point to mention because talking about characters entering stage left, a sort of placeholder character emerges at this time, because while this Western Bulldogs team has been quite rightly glorified and talked about, there is one key element missing from this team, and it is a key forward. And the media is criticizing them and crucifying them for not having one. And it begins to turn inwards. While they've been able to bring in people like Jason Ackermanis on a half-forward flank, there's this general sense that unless you have the big, bustling key forward, you are always going to fall short. And the Western Bulldogs find that when they recruit from Sydney big, bad, bustling, breaking, bruising Barry Hall, who actually does quite well for them. For the majority of the season, they're actually the premiership favourites, or at least one of the fancies, and he is delivering on every single promise that he has made to that club, despite sort of being in the twilight of his career. Everything seems like it's going quite well. And then we arrive at the 2010 preliminary final. Alex, talk us through what happens.
Well, they just get done like a dinner, really. I mean, it ends up being Brad Johnson's last game, and I think the 2010 Saints were just full of this fury, and the Bulldogs just got in the way, really. They were just a speed bump, a brief speed bump. There was this real anger to St Kilda, and then we know what happened the following week. The ball didn't bounce their way in the final moments, but I mean, they just got done much in the same way that there's this 97, 98 moment for the 90s Bulldogs. There's this 09, 010 moment. 09 was your shot. You just came up short. The next year you face them again. I mean, the difference is, of course, St Kilda go back to lose, because that's the nature of the St Kilda Football Club.
Indeed.
But, they come up against, an enemy that's just righteous in their anger. And that's it. They're done. The moment passes. That team they assembled starts to get picked apart over the next few years as they, as their moment passes again.
So again, all their best yields them is 3 preliminary finals, of which only one they were ever truly in. And so once again, it's been misery from 1961, arguably 1954, all the way through to some relevance in the late 90s, which is an enormous stretch of time. And then they go away for 10 years and they arrive back on the scene only to really serve other people's narratives on their way to greater things. And then they fall off the cliff again and they go back into the wilderness of Footscray. So just to talk you through, they in 2011, they finished 10th. And they end up getting pick 17 for that finishing 10th, thanks very much to the GWS entering the competition and their equalisation strategies, which they're able to draft Clay Smith. They then bottom out to 15th in 2012, where they recruit 2 players by the name of Jack McRae and Jake Stringer. One of those is a prolific ball winner at under 18 level. The other one is what we now know to be the classic mid-sized bad boy forward, as we've discussed on this before. But really, their sort of drop to the very, 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 very bottom occurs in 2013, where they actually get the 4th pick in the draft. And this is at a time when Fremantle have made the grand final. They are on the ascension. And one of the things that they have characterized about this team and why it's so good is the narrative of a big-bodied midfielder. Everyone's looking around at centre bouncers and they're seeing that Fremantle have these giants in Barlow, in Mundy, and in Nathan Fyfe, all who stand 189 or higher at the centre bounce. And so at the draft, the Western Bulldogs take a left turn. Everyone is expecting them to go for something conventional, but they pick the bolter of the draft, someone who has rocketed up the draft boards to this moment. And St Kilda do the conventional thing. They pick Jack Billings at number 3. And then in the 2013 draft, the Western Bulldogs select Marcus Bontempelli. And I have to say, in that moment, I thought it was a mistake. I don't know much about draft boards and things like that. None of us really do, because under 18 games are played at a level which we rarely get to see or rarely have an interest in. It's not quite the same as college hoops or something like that, when you get to see prospects broadcast live on a nightly basis. But anyone who reaches for a person based on whatever's in vogue at that moment, I had an issue with. But it turns to be a pivotal moment for them. Alex, what did you think of those drafting? So they went, obviously, Clay Smith, McRae, Stringer, and the Bont. And by that stage as well, I should also note they had Liberatore Jr. and Wallace Jr. as part of their rebuild. And they were lucky to get those good players, because that was at a time when they were quite good, and at the same time were able to get them because of the father-son rule. Yeah,
Lockie Hunter as well as the other one.
Oh, yes.
Father-son. They cleaned out as well. So after they fired their shot, they trade away Griffin, Higgins, Harbrow, Cal Ward.
I want to wait on Griffin before you go into Griffin. But yes, the other ones, because we're getting to 2014. Yeah, we're getting to 2014.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a great little draft period in retrospect. I mean, we're talking about Johannesson, McLean, McRae, as you said, Dalhouse, Easton Wood, Josh Dunkley, who Sydney don't take under the father-son, Caleb Daniels, Stringer, as you said, Bontempelli, and those father-son recruits. I remember when the Bulldogs were bottoming out, and I've always been a big fantasy football fan, and there was nothing more turgid than the Bulldogs on a Sunday afternoon in a meaningless fixture where the only thing that mattered was how many possessions did Matty Boy rack up in a midfield that just stunk to high heaven. That was the only thing I cared about. The only reason you would ever think about switching on to watch them. You know, it was them and St Kilda, the Sunday afternoon, 4:40 Etihad graveyard.
Yeah. Yeah. And a few players did stick around. You mentioned Matty Boyd there. He sticks around. Dale Morris, who is an All-Australian back, he sticks around. People like Brian Lake are sold high. They're moved to the Hawthorn Football Club, who eventually in 2013 wins a Norm Smith medal against our Fremantle Dockers. But they do a good job of cleaning house. They get these young pieces, but they don't get a number one pick. They don't get anything that at the time you could be really, really, really excited about. And the other key player who sticks around, who is hyper relevant to this story, is Bob Murphy. This spiritual leader of the club who sticks around throughout this entire rebuild and pretty much resigns himself to the fact that this is where he is going to play out the rest of his career. He is going to steward these players forward, the likes of Dalhouse and things like that, who were around at the time, a little bit older, obviously, with people like Dalhouse who are rookie listed, but he's going to steward them through to be the next players to have this crack. So he plays a very, very important part and eventually becomes their captain. But then our narratives collide again in a huge moment in the year 2014. And if it's all right, I'm going to take the lead on this one because I find this one fascinating.
Please do.
So the Greater Western Sydney Giants, who I am a huge, huge fan of living over here in Sydney now, they have just been racking up draft picks, as we all know. In their first draft, they had the first 5 selections. In the next one, they had the first 3. And then I believe in the next one, they have the next 2. And with those 2, or maybe it's one draft over, I can't exactly remember, but they pick 2 players. They pick Tom Boyd at number 1 and Josh Kelly at number 2. And now Tom Boyd is touted as one of these transformative key forward prospects. He is about 200 centimeters tall. He leads out of the goal square. He's got a huge boot on him. He's handsome as all get out. He is every single thing that a club would want in a key forward coming out of the draft. And he goes number 1 overall, despite the fact that Josh Kelly, I think we can all agree, even probably then was a far superior prospect and a far superior player. And the GWS Giants are now flush with talent. They have already their key forward stocks boast the likes of Jeremy Cameron. They have Jonathan Patton, who's taking that spot already. And they also have, from that very same draft, they have now Fremantle player Cam McCarthy, who's actually playing a lot of football for them. And in 2014, an interesting thing happens, and that is that Ryan Griffin, who is the captain of that football club. So we're not at the Bob Murphy stage by this stage, but it is Ryan Griffin, someone who suffered through those preliminary finals, has a huge falling out with They're the coach, who I believe is Brendan McCarthy at the time. And a whole lot of things happen behind closed doors. But the sum of it is that the captain of the Western Bulldogs asks to be traded to the expansion club, the Greater Western Sydney Giants. And this is a moment in which fans and pundits alike all agree that the Western Bulldogs have hit absolute rock bottom. I believe the coach gets sacked as a result of all of this, and Ryan Griffin still holds true to his trade request to go to Greater Western Sydney. And I remember at the time, Greater Western Sydney were chuffed as all hell. I think their press release read something like, "We look forward to working constructively with the Western Bulldogs to facilitate a trade that benefits all parties." They are loving it. The fact that this player wants to come to their fledgling club, they can't believe it. And then there is a sting in the tail of this. I don't know if, Alex, you want to pick it up from here as to what happens next.
Well, I think you've got it covered, KB.
All right, I'll roll on. And that is the fact that suddenly there's word out of GWS, and that number one pick, Tom Boyd, freshly minted at the club, has decided that he wants to go to the Western Bulldogs. And that flips the entire dynamic on its head, because GWS at the time had the Western Bulldogs dead to rights. They were going to be able to demand this player, especially at a time when there really was no player empowerment, even as recently as 2014. There is no free agency or anything like that in which we can play with here. And so suddenly the tables are turned, and the Bulldogs have this crack, this ability, this moment to get the fabled key forward that many believe actually stung them out of winning one of those 3 preliminary finals. And they sell the farm. They mortgage themselves to the absolute last brick of Whitten Oval. So the trade ended up emerging, which is the Bulldogs give up pick number 6 that they have gotten for all their horrible graveyard football that you mentioned already, Alex. And they also give up their captain, Ryan Griffin, for Tom Boyd to be paid over $1 million a year as an extremely, extremely young man. Do you remember that happening, Alex? Do you remember that trade at all?
I remember it very well. I remember thinking, geez, this better work for the Bulldogs. Ryan Griffin, since he's been at GWS, has been injured. He's been in and out a lot. And we'll get to Tom Boyd's moment, Errol Flynn with the sinking right boot. But I remember thinking they really cooked this, the Bulldogs. I thought Tom Boyd had shown glimpses in his AFL career. And of course, key forwards take a long time to come on. But I really thought at that point that this is a real watershed moment for them. This has to work. Otherwise, you can just smell more misery for them.
So they get their man. They get Tom Boyd. And this also breeds in a lot of animosity between these two clubs, which will play out over a number of years. This is the start of one of football's weirdest rivalries, but one I'm just really, really love because it's not rooted in something old. These are two teams now who have a genuine animosity based on recent events that is actually quite real and palpable. They're both on the ascension at the same time, and they both feel like the other one robbed them in that moment. And it's worth noting that, unfortunately, the GWS Giants don't do much with pick 6. They draft Caleb Marchbank with that pick. So, yikes. Yikes incorporated, but still, they managed to get Caleb Marchbank. Then the Western Bulldogs, they return to the finals in 2015. They have the honour of going up against Adelaide and getting roundly defeated. But nonetheless...
Well, when you say roundly, though, that was probably the best game of that season to that point.
That's true.
Well, the grand final was a stinker, but that was a fantastic elimination final. The Bulldogs had this incredible yelp about them.
That is right, actually. No, I've got the wrong game, yeah.
Yeah, they were up and about. They really served it up to the Crows. Inaccuracy really cost them. They were all over Adelaide for much of that final. Bontempelli was outstanding. It was that moment that you knew he was going to be good because under the spotlight, he he was the real deal. And as I recall, I think Tex kind of single-handedly guided Adelaide to a narrow win. And they had themselves to blame, the Bulldogs. But it was a high-scoring shootout. I remember watching it. It was a fantastic game. And you thought at that point, all these pieces they've assembled, they've actually come to something. You don't feel like they're there yet because they're still really young. They're still lacking this kind of, powerful forward presence. I mean, Boyd hasn't come on in the way he needs to have. But, you feel like they're coming. The midfield is really good. You've got the package, obviously, before the package loses the plot. I think that's the season when he's super exciting. He's on everyone's lips.
He makes All-Australian that year. He makes All-Australian in 2015, I believe.
Yeah,
and so
he was so good to watch.
Yeah, and that sets the stage for 2016. And this list is at a very strange point because we now have the veterans, the cast-off, the grizzled guys from those losing 3 prelims. And as we mentioned them by name, you have Bob Murphy, you have Dale Morris, you also have the likes of Matthew Boyd, who's eventually moved to a halfback flank because they sort of say to him, hey, we've got this young midfield coming through and there's really no place for you anymore to be here.
Yeah.
And they
do
also
you know what it's like, KB? It's
what's
actually,
it
like? Those guys are kind of like Harold or Alfred in Neighbours and Home and Away. They're just kind of there as a young talent comes through. You just always see them. It seems like they've been around forever. They just do what they do. The show needs them, but, it's really a breeding ground for pretty young things to kind of strut their stuff. Your Bontempellis, your Liberatores, your Stringers, your McRaes, and, Boyd and Morris, they're Harold and Alfred.
Any analogy that equates Marcus Bontempelli to Holly Valance, I am like, mwah, like 1,000% here for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would even go Margot Robbie for Bontempelli.
Yeah, actually, that's good. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I think so.
But they're sort of in this weird spot, right? So they have those veterans and they have a bunch of young players that we've detailed. Their midfield brigade is made up of the likes of notorious party boy Liberatore Jr. You have Wallace. You have McRae on... who else is in there?
Dalhouse is in there.
Dalhouse on a half-forward flank. Marcus Bontempelli is, centre square machine. And that's sort of your nucleus there. And down back you have the likes of Jason Johannesson, who's a dashing half-back flanker out of WA with a great haircut at this time. I think this was peak JJ's hair with the poodle salad. Like, love that.
Yeah, serious, wasn't it?
And then really up forward, they have just a motley crew again of forwards. You have Jake Stringer, the perfect mismatch. But other than that, you've got Josh Dunkley, you've got Toby McLean, you've got Clay Smith, who they drafted 17 overall. All these weird mid-sized forwards, and then hulking above them is Tom Boyd, who is so young and really not sure of himself by this stage. He doesn't quite know what to do with his body yet. He jumps at the wrong time. He leads wrongly. He's still quite raw and small. And so it's a real mixed bag, but they take this team into the year 2016 and they begin in quite shocking fashion. They play the Dockers at Etihad in round 1. And the Dockers, for those playing at home, have just lost a preliminary final themselves in 2015. And really, arguably, before going into that, a preliminary final that they should have won, at least on paper, and are stunned by the Hawks at home. And everyone's expecting them to come out with their, customary fire. And they get tuned up to the tune of 65 points by the Western Bulldogs, which starts off their season in fantastic fashion and really announces, most of all, Marcus Bontempelli. He has his coming out party all throughout the late 2015 and 2016 seasons. Do you have anything to reflect on that season, Alex, at that time? I have more here, but I'm just realised I'm talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember thinking, yeah, they're good, but they're still a year away. That was my impression watching them.
I would have thought more years away.
Well, yeah, a couple. I mean, I thought with that midfield, they are a couple of years away. There are a few missing pieces away still. I mean, you've identified that forward line. It's very similar, and that forward line isn't as good, but the 2008, 9, 10 forward line, similarly motley crew, motley size, medium forwards. They're not really operating by convention. Again, they are, KB, you're going to at some point take us to the last round of the year, but, they weren't ready yet, I think.
And so looking at their season, I think it kind of reflects that, right? I mean, they lose to the likes of Hawthorn, Geelong, and GWS, three teams who, you would expect to be much, much better than them. And they end up finishing the season in 7th place. But interestingly enough, that 7th is actually, in retrospect, a little bit misleading because they actually finished with 15 wins and 7 losses. But at the top of the ladder, finishing the home and away season, is Sydney, who actually only have 2 more wins than them. But what is actually interesting is the Western Bulldogs' percentage is criminally low, and we know that percentage is always a marker of whether a team is good or not. And they finished the season with a percentage of 115 compared to Sydney's 151. So there really is a stark difference there. But what I really want to touch on first of all is what happens in April. And in that loss to Hawthorn that I mentioned, the club's captain, Bob Murphy, sustains an ACL injury at 33 years old in a 3-point loss in the dying minutes of that match. And it is utterly heartbreaking. We knew that Bob Murphy was going to be hanging up the boots at the end of the year, although the coach, Luke Beveridge, who actually was hired in the wake of Brendan McCarthy being sacked in the Ryan Griffin scandal, backs him to play on. But that was a shattering moment for the veteran Bob Murphy, who had done so much for that beleaguered club, had been there through those losing preliminary finals, and does his knee in his final season.
He was also having a bit of a rejuvenation. They moved him down back, and he was an excellent kind of transitional rebounding defender. I remember that moment, the commentary, there was, all the commentary you listened to, that was just saying, oh no, it was that they felt the heartbreak of one of the AFL's best guys, having his career end.
Yeah.
In heartbreaking circumstances with a team that's on the up, when he's been through the dark periods. It was a terrible moment, and I thought, well, that's probably them done. Just purely from a spiritual, psychological perspective, that's a big thing to overcome for them.
Yeah, so they stumble into the end of the year. As I mentioned on the ladder, they end up finishing 7th. They have Sydney, Geelong, Hawthorn, and Greater Western Sydney rounding out the top 4. And Hawthorn, by this stage, we should mention, are the 3-time premiers, and they get to finish 3rd on that ladder. And then there's Adelaide, West Coast, the Western Bulldogs, and North Melbourne are quite a ways away. They finish with only 12 wins and 10 losses themselves to make the 8, compared to the Bulldogs 15 and 7. But in the final 6 games of the home and away season, the Bulldogs stumble. They actually win 3 and lose 3 leading up to their final game. And what was more concerning was in the final game that they played, they travelled over to Perth for Matthew Pavlich's 350th and ultimately final match. And they are belted. They're belted by Fremantle from the very, very beginning. From a lowly team that has ended up crashing to the bottom of the ladder, they are absolutely wiped off the park. And while Marcus Bontempelli continued his good run, having 27 disposals, he was tagged by Tom Sheridan. They couldn't get any run. And I remember that game vividly where I was watching them. And I remember thinking this was a side who was going into finals and had already booked their spot to travel over in 2 weeks' time to play the West Coast Eagles in Perth again. And this was the performance they put up at Subiaco Oval.
Yeah, so I was at the game as well. I just thought they're not much job. How are they going to kick any goals in the finals? Freo had been terrible that year and we just destroyed them. It was hard not to think that, they're just going to be bounced out in the first week. But, this is the first season where there's a break between round 23 and the first round of the finals, and doesn't it help the Bulldogs?
Well, it does. So anyway, we'll get there, but it's important to note at this point, and I'm sure you already all know this, but we're going to say it anyway, no team in the modern era has won the premiership from outside the top four, let alone the current situation. The only team to ever have done it at all is actually the Adelaide Football Club in 1997 when they win from fifth. And even then, they still had the pleasure of hosting a final in that time or finishing just outside. No one has ever actually won from the position outside the top four, and certainly never from seventh on the ladder. So by finishing seventh on the ladder, the Western Bulldogs earned themselves the privilege of flying home with their bulldog tails between their bulldog legs, having a week off, and then flying back to play the West Coast Eagles in an elimination final. And this is the part with this story when we are going to be waxing very, very lyrical about this entire run. Because this really, everything we've done at the moment is context setting, right? Everything's letting you know where this club has been and where they've arrived at. But this is where it starts. And it starts from being absolutely destroyed at Subiaco Oval by a lowly team. And when they fly back for their elimination final, the West Coast Eagles have just lost the grand final the previous year to the Hawthorn Football Club. And even though they've finished sixth on the ladder, lots and lots of pundits are tipping them to make a grand final run from six. I remember that narrative so vividly, and I actually believed it. I thought this was a good team that had underperformed throughout the year and were just starting to get it together now. And what better way to do it than by beating a young team who shouldn't be there on your home deck, a literal continent away from where they are based.
Yeah, and the Bulldogs come back, but they get some massive ins for the elimination final. So as you pointed out, they stumble in the last 6 weeks. And then with that extra week off, they're able to bring back McRae, Liberatore, Easton Wood, and Jordan Roughhead. They recall Stringer from the VFL. So they have 5 serious ins for that elimination final. And you feel like that extra week has never helped a team more than the Bulldogs.
So basically, they arrive in Perth for a twilight game against the West Coast Eagles and proceed to play some of the best football that this club has ever played.
So there you have it. After a heartbreaking 5-point loss to Adelaide this time last year, the Western Bulldogs enter another elimination final, this time playing away against last year's runners-up, the West Coast Eagles. To ensure you don't miss next week's episode on the rest of the final series, be sure to subscribe to Footy A to Z and turn on notifications. And if you're keen for some more Ruck Rover content in the meantime, we highly recommend you check out the video coming on screen now about Gary Ablett and the Gold Coast Suns.